Hello, everyone. This is the 39th episode of the Soccernostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles, and I'm joined by Paul from Shipley in England. For this episode, we interview with American historian and filmmaker Tom McCabe as we discuss his documentary Soccertown USA about the town of Kearny, New Jersey, home to three future USA internationals, John Harkes, Tony Meola, and Tab Ramos. This trio would help USA qualify to the 1990 World Cup, its first participation since the 1950 World Cup, as well as participating in the 1994 World Cup on home soil. Hello, Mr. McCabe. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
We always started off with our first-time guests by asking them to introduce themselves and talk about their first soccer-related memory.
Okay, I'm Tom McCabe, New Jersey, born and raised, but living here in London right now. I'm a trained historian, teach at Rutgers University, their Newark campus, and have been doing soccer history for decades now. My first soccer-related memory came from my hometown. I grew up in New Jersey, in a town called South Orange. And I call it an accident of geography because I grew up in a soccer town. There was an established recreation and club program. And in second grade, we started playing at recess back behind the grade school. And I remember it because they had, it doesn't seem safe now, but they poured cement, 2 little blocks, 4 different goals. So the second graders played on one little field and the third graders played on another little field. So you'd come and you put your jackets down on the 2 cement things and then you play. And we were the youngest group, so we didn't have a soccer ball. We played with one of those red kickballs. And these were some of the same people that are lifelong friends that we started playing together in second grade. And then we joined the recreation program and the club after that point. And a lot of soccer people were created from those back of the school pickup games. That's my very first memory, yeah.
Most USA soccer historians are aware of the Kearny, New Jersey reference with respect to the history of soccer in America. In the summer of 1990, this connection was highlighted with the presence of the aforementioned trio, John Harkes, Tony Meola, and Tab Ramos, members of the USA national team that qualified for the World Cup. Mr. McCabe's documentary, Soccertown USA, examines the history of this soccer-obsessed town and traces the journey of the trio that would be part of the historic 1990 and 1994 World Cup squads. I would also like to point out that I myself lived in New Jersey from 1985 to 1995 at a town called North Brunswick. This coincided with the World Cups of 1990 and 1994. I became aware of the Kearny connection in the run-up to the 1990 World Cup.
Yeah, I mean, it's Soccertown USA. I make an argument that it's the spiritual home of soccer in the United States. It has a long, long history, which gets mentioned in the documentary for about a 2-minute segment because we're really talking about it being a 1980s, 1990s story. With those 3 childhood friends that you mentioned that all play at the local club and they make their way into the national teams and then help qualification in 1989, go to Italy in 90, of course, and then host the World Cup for the first time in 94. But there are a lot of soccer towns around the United States, but Kearny has a special place even among those early hotbeds. Kearny, a Fall River, Massachusetts, a St. Louis, Missouri, and then it continues to spread. Soccer-loving states and places in Texas and California and the Pacific Northwest are all considered longtime hotbeds and current hotbeds.
Hello, Tom, and thank you for joining us. My initial question is, for those who aren't familiar, could you explain the Kearny, New Jersey phenomenon, particularly in respect to American soccer and its origins, that early history that you touched on?
Yeah, so part of my project as a historian is to prove that the United States has as long a soccer history as almost anyone. I'm working on a book project right now on the American Football Association, which gets formed in 1884. by Scottish immigrants working in the thread mill. Right? So that's one of the oldest FAs outside of Britain in the world. And they have a cup modeled after the English FA Cup. And that really starts with the immigration and its intersection with industry and, of course, leisure. And this is all kind of mirrored to what's happening in Britain, in particular, the northern part of England and in and around Glasgow, Scotland. A lot of immigrants come over. So it's an immigrant story, right? It's a very American story, right? America is constantly renewed by immigration. And American soccer is proof of that. So in 1870s, 1880s, you're having English and Scottish immigrants, most often from these mill towns, coming to the Eastern Seaboard. And this story plays out all over the place, but it plays out in a special way in Kearny, New Jersey, almost this like forgotten place. I'm toying around with using the Brigadoon construct, right? This kind of mystical, magical village that appears. And the geography is you have the Manhattan skyline, you have the Hudson River, and then you have the New Jersey towns that look out upon Manhattan, your Hoboken, your Jersey City, and then it's the swamps of Jersey, as Bruce Springsteen talks about in his songs, right? This kind of marshy, nasty, forgotten places where people dump their garbage, right? These are the Jersey jokes that constantly get made. And then right on the edge of the Meadowlands, the swamps of Jersey, is Kearny, New Jersey, right? This working class town of about 30,000, 35,000 people. And they have loved soccer just as long as anybody else. To borrow the metaphor from the thread mills, right? It's been a thread throughout the town's history from those 1870s, 1880s with the thread mills coming over all the way through till now. So yeah, it's a special place, but it's kind of like a forgotten place. It's fitting in some respects, right? That soccer has ebbed and flowed in the United States, high points, low points. The flame was first ignited in Kearny, I would argue, and then it flickers, right? And it's threatened of being blown out, disappearing at times throughout the course of history, but it's always alive in Kearny. So yeah, it's one of these foundational places in American soccer.
What was the spark that made you decide to work on this documentary, as it clearly feels like a passion project for you?
So growing up, I would go to Kearny for a couple reasons. One was we would play Thistle Soccer Club, which was the Kearny club, right? So you know that Scottish divide, Celtic Rangers, right? So they couldn't wear the hoops. They couldn't wear the, I guess, royal blue of Rangers. So they wore the colors of Scotland, right? That dark blue and red and white. And they named it after the country's flower, thistle, right? So going into Kearny was first as like an opponent. And it was like, it was literally a soccer town. They would have the lines painted on the blacktops next to the schools. They had this field complex, the Gunnell Oval, that was this dusty, rocky place right at the edge of the swamp. And you could see Manhattan in the distance. And there were just no other places like this that I had seen. And then I would go in there. We get meat pies at Easter or Christmas at one of the Scottish bakeries, fish and chips on a special occasion. And then there was a place, J&J, it's a soccer store, which there weren't many around in 1980s New Jersey. And I'd get goalkeeper gloves there, or at a place just down the road in Harrison, Martucci Brothers. So it was a magical, mystical place from when I was a boy. And then through university and graduate school, I was always kind of keeping the side project of soccer history alive. And I started writing a book telling the long story of American soccer from these mills in the late 19th century all the way through the World Cups that we've mentioned, 90 and 94, and telling that American story through the lens of Kearny. So I'm writing a book. I was living in Maryland at the time, and I get a phone call from Kiko Doran, Francisco Doran, and I call him the first of his kind, right? He's half Peruvian, half Scottish. And Kearny, like a lot of places in New Jersey, has migrated from maybe Western European influence, right? Where the Scots and the Irish and the English came. Now it's largely a Peruvian, Ecuadorian town. So he was the first of his kind. But Kiko calls me and he says, I hear you're writing a book on Kearny. I go, yes. And he goes, I want to do a documentary. And I said, so do I. I had never made one before. Always consume them as a viewer. And it was a detour away from the book and a multi-year project, but that was the spark. And then I hooked up with a college buddy of mine. We played soccer together at Princeton University, and Kirk Rudell was a comedy writer, Will and Grace, American Dad, but loving soccer all along. And I said, hey, I'm working on this documentary project. I've written a preliminary script. You want to take a look at it? And he said, yeah. And then he joined and became a leading force in getting that project over the finish line. Yeah, so that was it. Was kind of friends like, hey, we want to do this, and I'm like, yep, let's do it.
There's areas of Britain that are famous for producing disproportionate numbers of professional footballers, notably also industrial areas, parts of Scotland and the northeast England. But why do you think this happened in Kearny specifically?
I think they had seen this pattern, right? I mean, I guess what the Champions League team from Glasgow Celtic, I want to say 1967, right? What, weren't all of them within a 25-mile radius? So these men, these fathers, they were probably either Celtic or Rangers supporters, but knew that story, right? Jim Harkes, John Harkes' father, had played in Scotland, came to the United States and played, and then a carpenter by trade. But he came to the United States to play, as did some of the other fathers in the 60s. And they set up this club. So they knew that story. And Mr. Harkes kept on getting interviewed about his son and about the special qualities of Kearny. And it's like, he's a very funny man. He goes, what's in the water? There must be something in the water, right? Not the toxicity of the swamps jersey, but some special quality. But it happened because they tapped into this tradition in Scotland and in England. They had the generational story, right? So my father didn't give me soccer, right? I asked my father, I think first kicked the ball in like middle school. It's like some gym activity, right? I grew up in this soccer loving town. So that's how it was given. Now I've given it to my son, who is in his third year of professional soccer, right? So I think that's part of what we need to do. It needs to be passed down from father and mother to son and daughter, and that keeps on going. So these fathers in Kearny set up a club. They knew how to play. Are you as good as your brother? Are you as good as your father? Now, there was that kind of competitiveness from one generation to another. And then they set up the club and they created an environment. So I think a lot of it is what type of soccer environment are you brought up in? And that's increasingly happening in the United States. And I think we'll be closing the gap, or continue to close the gap to other soccer nations.
Can you describe your process in making this documentary, Soccertown USA, such as gathering all the information and all the video footage, finding and locating the people to interview?
So the process, I had to kind of teach myself how to make a documentary. So I remember signing up for a desktop documentaries. It was $100, and they would take you through a course online, how to write a script, where to position the camera, how to raise money, all the ins and outs. And that was before I got my friend Kirk Rudell involved, who's a writing pro. So there was this kind of like pre-production phase where we're learning, when we look back at our first camera angles, they were awful and we never used it, right? It was so pre-production. So we got to a stage where this is a really good story. Let's hire a freelancer. So Robert Penzel was out in LA. Kiko had met him through an interaction where he was actually filming. And then Kiko said, hey, we're working on this documentary, and ended up hiring him as a freelancer. So we would fly him out to New Jersey or wherever we're shooting the interviews, which you have to be on a shoestring budget. You have to be careful about that, right? So what we did on two different occasions, we set up at the United Soccer Coaches Convention, which moves around. One time it was in Baltimore, the other time it was in Philadelphia. So we set up our sets to interview Tab, Tony, John, Paul Caligiuri, Ralph Perez, Mike O'Neill in this setting, right? So we kind of maximized our time. And then we set up inside the Scots American Club, which was a social and athletic club in Kearny. And that became the backdrop for a lot of our interviews. So getting the story it centers around these three guys, right? And John Harkes had this group of like 5 or 6 plus really close friends, and we interviewed them. Then, of course, we interviewed Tony Meola's best friend, Sal Rosamilia, also a goalkeeper. And then Tab, we interviewed a couple of his close friends, but he almost became like the lonely guy who came to the one place where they didn't play soccer, America. But it also was an accident of geography for him, because he came to Kearny, Harrison area, Newark area, where he was able to grow his talent. So that was kind of it. Those 3 characters, and then the friends, and then obviously the commentators like a Sunil Gulati, a Paul Gardner. So we went to Sunil's office at Columbia University and interviewed him there. We went to Paul Gardner's apartment. So we picked up some of those national figures, the journalists, the president of U.S. Soccer. So yeah, they really helped tell the story. So then it's writing the scripts, having this freelance editor do that. I flew out to L.A. a couple times, stayed with Kirk, and we edited the film together, did the post-production stuff. The folks at Margarita Mix, a sound design studio, were unbelievable. So yeah, I mean, it was fun for me to kind of go from inception all the way through bringing it to the Kicking and Screening Film Festival. So it was a long process, but worth it. And we released it because we couldn't get a distribution deal right at the beginning of the pandemic. And we called it our gift to a locked up American soccer community. And maybe that's when you first saw it. But yeah, we let it out to the people because we just didn't want to hold on to it any longer. We wanted to share it.
One of the things that's really striking about it and really brings it to life as well is the home video footage of them playing as kids. How did you manage to track people down who had that footage, and were they happy to share with you?
Yes. It's a community story, right? So the community really got behind it. And that video, so when you go back to the 80s, right, there was often in like let's say a middle class and above neighborhood, there was that one parent who had that big video camera on the shoulder or on the tripod. And Kearny being a working class place, it wasn't exactly like everybody's carrying around a big video, but there was this one parent who would film the club games. And that's where that video came from. And then the high school put up a tripod. So the school owned one, and they would film the high school games, because the high school was one of the best high school teams, not only in the state, but in the country at the time. So that was the basis. And we were looking for footage of the pickup scene, right, at that blacktop. And we couldn't find one picture, one moving image of that, because it was very organic. It was kids running it. So it wasn't like today. Imagine all the great footage you'll have from iPhones and stuff. So we struggled to get that. Another image that we struggled, we kept hearing about these bus rides during the 1994 World Cup, right? Literally yellow school bus up and down the California freeway where they're putting the kegs on and chanting and singing and bantering with the other fans from Columbia on the highway, or in the parking lot. And finally, somebody said, this woman might have a picture. And it was one of these eureka moments. So I get in touch with her. She ends up taking out a photo album and taking pictures with her phone. And there's the yellow school bus. And I'm just like, yes, it wasn't myth. It wasn't apocryphal. It actually happened. So she ended up FedExing those images. We scanned them. And, that illustrated part of the story. We found a photograph after the fact. So where the Kearny Army in high school was walking across the field, right? At the end of each quarter. They played quarters back in those days, carrying kegs and flags. And everybody talked about it, but we didn't have an image. And one shows up. Somebody had watched the film from the opposing team and sent it to a friend of mine they both grew up in Freehold, and he sent it to me. And sure enough, it's this line of people marching across the field, a still photograph that somebody took from the stands. So those are the gems. Those are the finds. And some panned out and some didn't. But yeah, those are the treasures, the photograph, the footage. And the graininess, the lack of quality kind of brings that nostalgia back, right? It's actually in some ways better than a crystal clear image to have it rough around the edges.
Yes, I must say you managed to interview a lot of the locals, so to speak, who gave a specific perspective in about that era, about that vibe, takes you back to that time and place and all that. Besides the video footage, like you said, how did you get the word out that you're looking for this material?
We asked that group that we interviewed, who should we talk to? Who has photographs? Who has this? Like somebody had video, but it got destroyed, Hurricane Sandy, because it was left in the basement, right? I'll give you a classic example. Jimmy Burns owned a video camera, and he's the one who took the footage of the parade when they came back from the 1990 World Cup, right? In front of City Hall or Town Hall. There were the speech making, them pulling up in the Corvettes. That was from him. And he was a really good friend of John Harkes, would travel to England and bring his video camera. We have a little clip of him playing for Sheffield Wednesday in and around winning the FA Cup, scoring that goal of the year against Peter Shilton. So you would hear who had what, and then we would reach out. We'd ask for contact, or we'd figure out how to get that person. So with Kiko being a Kearny guy, me being a New Jersey guy, we had some street cred, if you will. So they trusted us and they wanted their story told. And I'm glad you said that it kind of evoked an era, right? Like the 1980s, right? The 80s are back in such a big way. I'm growing my mullet out in COVID right now. And Kearny was this great place because kids were wearing like sambas on the streets. They're playing street soccer. They got the long mullets, but it was all in this American environment. So we would always tease it was like all the right moves with Tom Cruise and the Pennsylvania steel town and the role of American football meets Goodwill Hunting, right? These kind of rascals from Southie getting in trouble and finding their way. So yeah, we tapped into that. And a model for us was the great documentary Dogtown and the Z-Boys, that skateboarding documentary of how they go from surfing to skateboarding and really bringing that surfing culture into making modern skateboarding. So without those kids from that California beach town, you wouldn't have Tony Hawk, where during the drought in the 70s, 80s, pools are empty and now they're zipping and zagging. So I think both that film and our film are kind of these hero journeys, right? The quest. And for John, Tab, and Tony, the quest is to get to the World Cup, to get respect, and then bring the global party to the United States in 1994 and prove that we can hang with the best. And that's why that Colombia game, for some, the pre-tournament favor was so important.
And looking back at the long history, when would you say was the height of soccer in Kearny? Would you say this era that is the peak, or would you maybe trace that back in time?
I'm going to go two or three peaks. So it's there right at the beginning. And then it grows. And then there's actually multiple professional leagues. Like there's the first professional league in the United States is 1894. And it lasts for like 17 days, right? So it was set up the tent. It didn't work. And for a combination of reasons, we don't need to get into it here. So you have some late 19th century professionalism, but then you have a real professional league in 1921. Right. So the decade 1920 up to the Great Depression kind of killed the league. It was mostly imports from Britain. Right. So between working at a mill job and then the soccer wages, you can make considerably more money playing soccer in the United States than you could in England or Scotland. Right. And that's why they came. Some big players came from some big clubs to play in this league, and that had this foreign influence. So there were crowds of 10, 15, 20,000 on a regular basis in the 20s in the American Soccer League. That goes out with the Great Depression, and then some people call it the Dark Ages, right? And then we have this modern story where I'm a child of the Pele generation, right? Pele comes and he animates the North American Soccer League in the 1970s. And this is then the explosion of youth soccer, often coming out from an NASL franchise. In our case, it was the Cosmos putting 70,000 plus into Giant Stadium, outdrawing the New York Yankees, the New York Football Giants, and these global stars that we all wanted to be like and copy. And then it's Tab, Tony, and John, right? Those pioneers getting us to the World Cup. At the same time, you have the youth movement for the women pushing that to become a global power. So yeah, I would maybe say that those three periods, which demonstrates our long history, and then the kind of the up and down, right? So in England, in Scotland, and other places, you have this continuum of professional soccer. We have discontinuities. Major League Soccer is 25 years old. It's the longest running professional soccer league in our history. And that's wonderful, but we need decades more, generations more to be on par with others.
Let's talk about the protagonists, John Harkes, Tony Meola, and Tab Ramos. Can you describe the link between them, and when was the first time that all three played together?
That's a little bit of a mystery, but let me go the three. Interesting, they all kind of represent a strand of, I guess, soccer immigration, soccer migration. So let's start with John. He represents this Scottish influence in Kearny from the very beginnings of American soccer, right? With the thread mill workers and the earliest soccer players all the way through in Kearny. From that moment till now, because Mr. and Mrs. Harkes lives in the same apartment building that John and his brother and his sister grew up in, which is right down the block from the Scots American Club, right? So, I mean, they represent that. And John would be like that kind of Tom Cruise, right? Kind of pin-up, good-looking guy, funny, gregarious. Everybody's kind of great storyteller. So he's kind of that person. Then you have Tab. So Tab grew up in Montevideo, Uruguay. So he represents the South American immigration. So I believe in his family, like a lot of folks in Uruguay or Argentina, he has roots in Spain and Italy, right? They left those countries, Uruguay, and now he comes up. So his dad got a job in a factory in Harrison, and he just came up. There had been a local depression in Montevideo, so he comes up to work, sending money back. He didn't like it. He comes back, but faithfully, he had filed some immigration papers. And second depression hits, he had vowed never to come back. He has to bring the family now, right? So it was a matter of necessity, right? He has to put food on the table, roof over heads. So that's why they come to Harrison when Tab is about 10 years old, 12 years old. And he was just about to sign for, I think, Nacional, one of the big clubs in Uruguay. And he's like, God, of all places I'm coming to, it's the United States where they don't play soccer. But he was lucky. It was Kearny, Harrison, and the like. And he doesn't have complete grasp of the language. I mean, now he's like unbelievably fluent, but he was kind of a little bit of a loner. But it was the soccer ball that then introduced him to his first friends. He was living in Harrison at the time, very close to where Red Bull Arena is now. Parents were both working in local factories. So he goes to this courts where they're playing the pickup soccer, and then they realize he's good. This is one of my favorite stories about Tab. He's playing for Harrison Recreation, a league, and he got to wear an orange shirt. From the 1978 World Cup, Holland had trained in Uruguay or played some preliminary games there. So he thinks he's playing for total football, the Dutch national team, and he shows up and he scores 10 goals in his first kind of micro soccer game. And they said, you can't play anymore. You need to go up the road to Thistle Soccer Club. So literally that very first game, he's banned because he's too good. And then he gets sent up to the club. And that's where he and John first start to play. They're the same age, right? So they were playing on two separate teams in the same age group. And then they're like, let's put these guys together, right? So they have a long history of playing together. And then we have Tony, younger than by a couple of years than those guys. So he had to wait to mature a little bit for when they started playing together. So I want to say late in their youth soccer career, they played together. And then Tony represents that Italian American immigration. Dad played in Italy, immigrates to the United States, is a barber by trade, bought a house in Kearny, even though his barber shop was in a neighboring town. And Tony is this 3-sport star: soccer, basketball, and baseball, and just this big strapping guy. So yeah, they all come together late in their youth soccer careers, but then really, really start playing together because Tab breaks into the national team first, and then John joins. And then there's kind of an injury crisis among American goalkeepers at one particular point in 1988, and that's when Tony joins. Literally, they're playing in the Marble Cup at Giant Stadium. First goalkeeper is out. Second one gets hurt, and they don't have a goalkeeper. So Tab or it was probably John, and then Tab's there too. We're like, hey, our buddy's just up the road in Kearny. He's good, right? And he had played in youth teams. So he gets a new pair of gloves at J&J Sport and goes to the hotel and meets up with the team and plays. Goalkeeper gets hurt. His very first moment with the senior national team is a penalty kick, and he gets scored on. And Tony says, yeah, they couldn't get any worse than there, right? I didn't even touch a ball and I gave up a goal. And then he kind of forges his way into the team and has a string of shutouts, which get him to the World Cup in 1990.
You've touched on this generation growing up with the North American Soccer League and the New York Cosmos being the nearest team geographically. What do you think the effect of that was on Kearny itself and football in Kearny? Massive influence. So I'm Tony Meola's age. So I came of age at the same time in a couple towns over. And it was everything to go to these games and then come back home and try to imitate your stars. They did it on the blacktop. We did it in front yards and backyards in a suburban setting. So yeah, you can't underestimate. I mean, when I talk to Sal Rosamillion, Tony Meola, and myself, we're all goalkeepers, and we all talk about those same few guys and trying to learn from them. And then John would do it. He was a huge Beckenbauer fan. That's why he wore number 6. Tab loved some of the tricky South American players who ended up showing up at Giant Stadium. We got to see these great heroes. So that was amazing. And then in the film, we introduced these 2 friends. They literally grew up across the street from one another. Santiago Formosa, a Spaniard from Vigo, Spain, and Hughie O'Neill from Glasgow, Scotland. So they were in around the same age. They kind of come through the youth system, the university system, and they both get drafted and play for the Hartford Bicentennials. They're on the same team. And then Santiago gets to come home and play for the Cosmos. So the John, Tab, Tony, the others would see them in town. And they're like, well, they can do it. Why can't I do it? So it was that amazing example that got passed down from one generation to the next. So yeah, you can't underestimate the power and influence on players of the North American Soccer League. And I really think that league and some of the players saw themselves as missionaries to bring the game to the heathen sporting culture, right? You know, there was some of that, but structurally things started to change, right? There were summer camps, there were clinics, there were clubs. So the infrastructure started to grow. And Kearny became one of the towns. What are they doing there? Okay, this is how they set it up. This is the league they're playing in. So people joined to rub elbows with them. The town I grew up in, South Orange and Maplewood, Gene Chisowitz, who was a Hall of Fame member, he coached at the high school for like 30 plus years. But refugee, I want to say from the Ukraine, Germany to Pennsylvania, and then found his way as a gym teacher and a coach in this town. And he started the club in 1967, right? So you needed these kind of pioneers to say, okay, we're going to organize it, we're going to develop it, and then it organically goes from there. But going to the stadium and watching these players was part of that.
This generation also witnessed the folding of the NASL. How did that affect Kearny, and were these young players discouraged for their future of the game there as a result?
Yes, but there are some unintended positive consequences from that. So you look at Kearny, you look at Harrison, you look at Newark. There were all these factory jobs, right, that provided a living wage. Those jobs went away as the United States deindustrializes, right? You get the Rust Belt phenomenon. So the factories close, they go to the American South, they go out of the country altogether. So men, mostly in Kearny, and women working in the thread mill or the linen mill or RCA, General Motors, Westinghouse. I mean, massive multinational companies. Those good jobs go away. So now this generation and a bit older, Tab, Tony, and John, look to soccer, right? And they want to be pros. Not everybody can do that, of course. And so when this league closes in 1985, college, let's go to college. And they used soccer to get scholarships. And then that changes the family trajectory, right? Because we all know secondary education and then university education is so important to upward mobility in the United States. So Robert McCourt, who is the current coach at Monmouth University, talked about how it was a ticket out. I didn't have to necessarily do the work that my dad was doing. I could get a university education and go into he was a banker before he became a coach. So these are all now new possibilities, new avenues to pursue. So yeah, they tapped in through soccer into higher education, which I think is a positive. It's not necessarily going to make a wonderful professional soccer player, right? Because you need to be playing every day and at the highest levels. But yeah, that was one of the unintended benefits of the shuttering of the NASL. But to answer the question more directly, it was hopes dashed, dreams deferred, that we don't have a league to play in. So you see guys like Tab and John in particular have to go elsewhere, right? Tab goes to Spain. John goes to England. Another kind of the inside story for Tab. University of Virginia, where John went, where Tony went, was the power, and they desperately wanted Tab to go to the University of Virginia, Bruce Arena. And he ended up going to a rival, North Carolina State, because they had an Argentine coach who played in the World Cup, Tarantini. Tarantini's brother was involved in Spanish soccer. So the father, Mr. Ramos, Julian Ramos, and Tab were like, he's going there. He can speak Spanish with the coach. The dad can communicate with him. And then there's kind of this promise of, we'll introduce you to people we know in Spain, right? And that's exactly what happened. He ends up going to Figueres. Yeah. Yes. And then that morphs into Real Betis. And then he comes back as the first player signed in Major League Soccer. So yeah, there's all these, kind of happenstance. But there was a meeting in Paul Gardner's New York City apartment, right near the Natural History Museum. And it's Ted Howard, who was, I think, commissioner of North American Soccer League, Mr. Ramos, Paul Gardner, Sunil Gulati, and the headmaster of St. Benedict's Prep, where I worked for many years, Father Edwin Leahy, and a confidant of Tab and his father, because Tab went to St. Benedict's. Sidebar, so did Greg Berhalter, Claudio Reyna. So that's another great little soccer story, the story of Benedict's. But the question was, should Tab sign for the Cosmos? Because he was drafted. And the frank talk that day was, we think this league is going to shut down. That was 1984. So Tab decides to go to college soccer instead. And it works out for him because he gets through the college years and ends up signing professionally with the Spanish club.
In most American high schools, I'm guessing that gridiron or American football, baseball and basketball would have taken precedence. Was that the case in Kearny, or was soccer always the number one sport?
So I've done some digging. Like the first, I want to say official, varsity program sanctioned by the school was in early 1920s, right? So it coincides with this arrival of the professional league and some of the professional teams, literally in Kearny. So going all the way back 100 years, they had varsity squads. They also had American football, and they built a stadium that still exists. Beautiful old stadium back behind the school, and you can actually see the New York skyline from up high in the bleachers. And that was the domain of the American football team. They always got first preference, right? But over the course of history, they weren't very good. It was the soccer team that was winning all the state championships. Same thing with Harrison. So yeah, the football teams would the spectacle around that, the crowds around that were always bigger, and therefore they got the kind of seat of honor, the big stadium, and the soccer teams would play elsewhere. But they were big programs, right? It was hard to make the team. They were winning championships. So across time, and literally Kearny and Harrison have this kind of border rivalry. Kearny is bigger area wise and probably twice the number of residents, right? And, it was kind of big brother, little brother, and they would play on election day. And this is in the 20s and the 30s. And there was a big brawl like in 1937 where people on the field, off the field, and the two boards of education banned the game for over 10 years, 15 years. And then it came back on. So there was a ban, and they now play a one-off game because they're in different leagues because of the size of the school. They play at Red Bull Arena, and they get 5,000 plus fans for a high school game. So it's still a big deal. I mean, even some kids aren't playing high school soccer because they're in the academies and focusing on a higher level. It's great to represent your town, be the big man on campus. So yeah, high school soccer was big and continues to be part of the story. Yeah, we love that section of town, of the movie, like the high school soccer. We had the footage. We had this great game where the Kearny Army, who shows up later in Los Angeles, is razzing the goalkeeper from Freehold, who you can't really tell. He had this like obnoxious mohawk and his name on the back with the 00. So they were teasing him. He was a character and giving it back to him. So yeah, I mean, you're not gonna get that at an academy soccer game, but you will get that at a high school soccer game between fierce rivals.
As I mentioned in the intro, I first heard of the Kearny connection in the run-up to the 1990 World Cup. And I remember reading articles about it in Soccer America magazine. Also, during the World Cup itself, you may remember this or not. Remember, the World Cup matches for the 1990 were broadcast on TNT, Turner Network Television. I remember seeing a report on this whole Kearny connection. Do you remember that report?
I'm sure I do, but I'm in my head. The TNT. I don't remember if they were the provider. I'm sure they are. I trust you, but yeah, and these were some foundation. We were super proud being from New Jersey, right? And saying like, yeah, these guys are a couple towns over, right? I mean, you had Peter Vermees too, right? So he was a Jersey guy. So there were 4 Jersey guys on the starters. 4 of the 11 were starting, including the spine, right? John and Tony, and Vermees was up front. So there were all sorts of reports, people coming into Kearny, like asking that very question. What's going on here? Is there something in the water? How can you produce all this talent? So there are some great ones from ESPN. You say TNT, Soccer America. I called up Mike Watella, who wrote, along with, I think it was Paul Kennedy, they co-wrote a story, It's in Their Blood, about Kearny, New Jersey, and describing it. So these became kind of bedrocks for my own scholarship, my own inquiry, these journalists getting there. We named the film Soccertown USA. And there were other Soccertown USAs. Seen an article on Oneonta, New York, upstate New York, that had the National Soccer Hall of Fame in the late 70s and through the 80s and 90s. They were dubbing themselves Soccertown USA. First appearance of that, I saw it in a newsletter out of Kearny, their Thistle Club. One of the leaders, Tom McCabe, said, "Are we Youth Soccertown USA?" Because a bunch of the players, including Harkes and Meola and Ramos and McCourt and Billy Galco, they were all playing for youth national teams. So they started calling themselves Soccertown USA. And then a sign appears on Kearny Ave between the 90 and 94 World Cups. And it basically says, we have it in the film, a photograph, "Welcome to Soccertown USA, home of Harkes, Meola, and Ramos." And just to kind of twist the knife a little bit more, it's facing Harrison, right? So as you're coming out of Harrison, it's Frank Rogers Boulevard. They would never call it Kearny Ave, right? And headed into Kearny. Just this reminder that we've got 3 guys, you don't have any type thing. So, yeah, I mean, these media reports, these articles were key to kind of getting that name out, that nickname. And I won't call it a brand, but yeah, Soccertown USA.
Another of the snippets from the film, and it's a little hard to imagine this one, but the future World Cup goalkeeper Tony Meola playing as a striker in Kearny. How did that come about?
So we interviewed Dr. Joe Matchnick, who had pioneering goalkeeping camps, still has them in the United States. He's the kind of rules expert for Fox for Champions League matches. He's still very much on the scene. We interviewed him, and he described Tony as one of the first modern goalkeepers because he could use his feet. And he learns how to use his feet in Kearny. I mean, he's a fantastic athlete, very coordinated, eye-hand coordination, strong. All those people will say he and this other guy, Kevin Hoey, who no one else knows about, but they were the 2 best all-around athletes in the history of Kearny High School. And Tony is playing on these blacktops. They wouldn't play with goalkeepers, right? So it was small goal. So if Tony wanted to play, he had to play in the field. So as a goalkeeper, myself, I started out as a midfielder and then just kind of always found myself before practice in the goal. And then once I went into the goal, my feet suffered, right? Can only really kick with my right foot. But Tony was playing in all these pickup games. And then we get Sal and Tony, right? Best friends. They went to rival kind of grade schools and then met up in middle school. And then, so they were rivals first, always playing against each other. And then they became best friends. And I love that story of friendship. And Sal can't play in the field. Tony can. So Sal plays full-time in the goal and Tony plays full-time out in the field. And he led the state in scoring that year. So you see this big, powerful, and I want to say he had a bunch of goals on headers, long throws. So his physical number 9 presence was felt. So I think, one, that's a testimony to Tony being an all-around athlete, a real pioneer in terms of modern goalkeeping, being able to use your feet, and then the friendship. His best friend, let him play.
Well, in most of America, the lead up to the 1990 World Cup was subdued and not really publicized. Clearly, with Harkes, Meola, and Ramos being integral parts of the team, it would have been different in that community at Kearny. How was daily life and expectations in the lead up to the World Cup in the community?
So you have John and Tab on the team, right? They were kind of in the picture in '88, right? With the Olympic team, and then that spins into qualifying. And then Tony joins late, right? He plays, it was Vanoli. David Vanoli was the starter and doing very well. And then Jeff Duback, I believe, was the backup. And Tony, through this Marlboro Cup, we need the goalkeeper, emergency goalkeeper kind of emerges. And Joe Matchnick was the goalkeeper coach at that time. So I really think Bob Gansler and Joe Matchnick must have had discussions that let's go with Tony. He's athletic. He's good on crosses. He can kick. Let's go with him. So now you have these 3 guys in the midst of qualifying, and they have to pitch shutouts, and that dramatic game they have to win down in Trinidad. So there were parents and some Kearny residents who went to Trinidad for that match. There was a little pocket of U.S. support in that sea of red in the stadium, which is another one of our favorite parts of the film, right? Going down into this festive environment. Trinidad's going to qualify for its first World Cup, and we're up against it, a bunch of young college kids. So back home in Kearny, they had watch parties, I guess before there were watch parties. And that's in the film. scenes from the Scots American Club, right? Again, Jim Burns had his video camera out and filming people watching the games, and they're chanting, "Ole, ole, ole, here we go, here we go." So they definitely followed. There were banners across Kearny Ave, good luck on the way to qualifying. And of course, the World Cup. There were the parades. There were signage in individual shops. So it was hard being a resident of Kearny and not knowing that these three local heroes were leading the way. And they celebrated that hometown nature. And then I think from there kind of spun out into the New Jersey soccer community, because we're all reading Soccer America. We're following the margins of the newspapers, the results, right? At that era, you really had to go out of your way to consume soccer media, because it was very much not on the air, in the margins. So yeah, there was almost like kind of a tribal aspect. We're all pulling for the U.S. And to qualify for that World Cup was instrumental, right? Because it's before the first Women's World Cup. It's also after we've been awarded the 1994 World Cup. So it's key that we qualify and get those experience those growing pains before 94.
In the aftermath of the 1990 World Cup, obviously those players moved on, as you've mentioned. John Harkes and Tab Ramos came to play in Europe, and the three of them would be reunited again in 1994. But what was the effect in the intervening period on soccer in Kearny, those players leaving?
So they became the Huey O'Neills and the Santiago Formosas, right? The success stories. And there was a bigger group of them. So I think it became, hey, let's go to college and play soccer in college and then see where that takes us. And a lot of them ended up in coaching, right? They got their college degrees and they went into education and coaching. So that Kearny influence ripples out. And you look at the three main characters. Tab is at Houston Dynamo right now. John is sporting director and head coach at Greenville in South Carolina. Tony had been coaching, in Jacksonville. Now is developing very nicely as a color commentator on the TV and doing a radio show. So they're all kind of forces in the American soccer scene today. So they became the examples. They became the shining examples to that next generation. But so there's no pro league. But there's like, maybe we can get to the national team, right? Which is super hard to do. I mean, I feel if you weren't one of those national team guys, you were lost. It was like a lost generation of talent. So what did they do? They went to college. They went into coaching. They went into their, professional careers, but then coached their kids, right? So that is an important generation. The national team players, both on the men's and women's side, and then those just outside, they became people who passed it on to the next generation. So they're heroic too, but unknown in a lot of respects, maybe unknown outside their local community. So yeah, I mean, the NASL goes, these guys go out, and then there are these rumors that there's going to be a professional league, right? And it was supposed to happen with the 1994 World Cup. Sepp Blatter and others were like, we're giving the World Cup to a country that doesn't have a professional league, and that became one of the critiques of that project. So the promise was made, deal was struck that, okay, if you give us the World Cup, we'll have a professional league, and it gets pushed out to 96. And who do they turn to? Sunil Gulati calls up Tab, as it says in the film, right? He's an attacking star. He played for the national team. He was Latin, local guy. We got to get him. And then when you get Tab, and then you get John, and then Paul Caligiuri, Eric Linalda, these guys playing overseas. When you get this concentration, then things start to happen, and they build for the opening first kick of Major League Soccer in 1996. So that's the end of the film, right? So we kind of carry it from being this very important historical town in terms of soccer through these World Cups to the coming of Major League Soccer, which is now 25 years old. So there are local kids and kids all over in these other soccer towns that we make reference to who can now dream of playing for the national team, men's and women's, and playing in Major League Soccer and the NWSL. So it's a totally different landscape. But these three local guys helped create that for sure. And I really think they knew it, but then to put it on the screen, put you in your proper place in American soccer history. That's got to be. They were pleased with the film, of course, right? I mean, because they're like, yeah, we did that.
It has been more than 30 years now. How is the soccer scene currently in Kearny?
So, Kearny, I said before, immigration constantly renews America, but there's tension there. So in Kearny, you had the fish and chip shops up and down Kearny Ave, the pubs, very Scottish and Irish influence in the town, and that's changed. So a lot of the local Scots community and Scotch Irish moved out of Kearny down to the kind of Jersey Shore, Ocean County, Monmouth County. So a lot of these guys that we interviewed that grew up in Kearny in the 70s and 80s don't live in Kearny anymore. They did that migration down to the Jersey Shore. Who moved in? First the Portuguese, then the Peruvians and Ecuadorians. So now you have kind of this tension between these immigrant communities. And that transition didn't necessarily go smoothly. John Silva, who was a star for Kearny High and then played at Seton Hall University, he came right after Tab, Tony, and John. Great goal scorer, creative force. And he had a great line. He goes, "I'm Portuguese, but I grew up Scottish," right? Because he plugged into the Scottish influence. But then it starts to become fewer and fewer of the Scottish and the Scotch-Irish, and it's more Portuguese and more Peruvian. So if you want to measure it by the high school, they dropped, right? During this kind of tension as the scene changed, the faces changed. And there was probably conflict and tension within the team, right? You've got Portuguese kids, some Scottish kids, Peruvian kids, they can't figure out how to share a ball, right? And those were some down years in the late 90s. And then now Billy Galka, who is in the film, is the current coach for Kearny High School. And he's built this thing back up. They've won the state championship, which is the hardest one to win because it's the biggest schools, because Kearny is a big high school. And they're back in the discussion of winning state titles. Some of their best players in town don't play high school soccer. They represent Red Bull Academy, one of the top academies in the country. So it's back, but it looks a bit different, right? The names are different. The backgrounds are different, but Kearny still has a strong soccer team. But yeah, it's the American soccer story, the American story writ small. You can look at it and examine it through the lens of Kearny.
Another really strong theme in the documentary is the importance of street football, and that's something I grew up with, and a lot of people in my generation. Is that still as important? Does that still take place in the same way, or is it dying out with the academies that you've talked about and other avenues of playing?
So to address your last point, kids are playing more structured soccer for sure, right? It's more days per week because the more units, I guess, you need, right? And the parents, are like, you need to train more, you need to do it, right? So it's kind of driven from I think the parent side and the club side. We need to be doing more. Whereas this organic culture that came up from the streets, it was the kids, right? They were driving it. Let's go play. Let's get out there. Let's make our teams. Winner stays on. That was a creation of the kids. So that space that it's called the courts. It's in Harrison. It's literally a 5-minute walk from Red Bull Arena. It used to be blacktop. Used to be trees in it, and the fence was all beat up, and it was kind of physically dangerous to play. You'd get bruises and bumps, and it would toughen you up. And another thing was it was across age groups, right? You'd have kids as young as 12, 13 with men just off work looking to get a game. So there was that. And that kind of put a whole different edge on people and learning experience to play. So that's still going on. It's turfed. That same space still exists. You'll see when I drive by, you'll see sometimes that like the littlest kids are being trained in there by adults. So it's lost a little bit of that kind of always being run by the kids. One of the interesting things in Kearny and Harrison, because recreational space is at a premium, right? Because it's very dense. They've turfed all these places. The U.S. Soccer Foundation turfed a small field down by the river that we show in a drone shot. Red Bull Arena has done it. So they see the value in micro soccer and pickup soccer, street soccer, if you will. So it's getting played, but there are more spaces to do it. And it's throwing down jackets and playing to the small goals. So yeah. And one of the cool things from the movie, and I have friends in youth soccer, coaching, decision makers. And one of the things that they really look at is that street soccer. We need more of that. So you see around the country, U.S. Soccer Foundation, Major League Soccer, creating these spaces. Some of them are blacktop and then others are turfed. And there's a club that has in the coaching ranks very much a Kearny influence in it called the Players Development Academy. It's out in West Jersey. And they just, I think 2 weeks ago, a month ago, finished a small microfield with turf that they raised the money for, and they built in New Brunswick. So not far from North Brunswick, where you live briefly. But in an urban environment, we need this. And now it's kind of become this mecca, this calling for kids to play. So hopefully somebody else will make another film, the importance of this one place that all these great players came from. So yeah, I mean, there's this tension between organized soccer and the street soccer, right? Literally within the game. Some people want to orchestrate everything versus the improvisation, right? That tension in the game. So we feel wonderful about, in a small way, shining a light on the importance of unstructured free play. And we do it in an interesting way with these cast of characters. Mike O'Neill, let's make a deal, O'Neill. Hey, wear red. And then they stack their team, and then they run the table, and then they never, because when you lost, you had to go to the back of the line. You're 5 or 6 or however the number was, and you'd have to wait on a certain day, a half hour, 40 minutes to get back on. So you really wanted to keep that string going.
Is there anything new you learned in the process of making this documentary that perhaps may have been a blind spot previously?
Well, I've finally kind of figured out who I am. And I think the short answer there is I'm a storyteller, right? I'm a historian. I can teach formal classes in history at the university. I can share my passion for soccer through the historian's lens, but it's all storytelling, right? So I think the blind spot that I had was in storytelling. So the process of making this documentary, I'm kind of unabashedly calling myself a storyteller. So I think in scenes more than I did before, right? What makes up a good scene? And certainly we have different scenes in this documentary. So recognizing the scene, recognizing storytelling techniques, a lot of them I learned from Kirk Riddell, right? So he's a professional writer, comedy, and you've got to hold someone's attention across a half an hour episode or across 68-minute documentary. You got to have the right pacing, the right rhythm. So I think for me, some of those blind spots would be in the art of storytelling. So it helped me see it in a new light and become a better storyteller. In terms of American soccer, a blind spot would certainly be gender, right? This is a particularly male story. That would be a blind spot considering how important soccer is to girls and women. But having lived in Europe, I live here now and lived here 15 years ago. One of the critiques, soccer, isn't that a girl sport in the United States, right? That they like to jab that one in. So in an interesting kind of reverse way, showing an all-male story goes, okay, yeah, our women are really good, but we've got men's teams too, right? So I would love, I've never really seen it, but I often think of kind of doing a history of the national team with the men and women side by side, not separating them, kind of out of this NASL, this youth soccer movement. It could be a fascinating project. I don't know if that answered your question, but maybe I have more blind spots I got to be aware of.
I mean, for me, it was a real revelation to discover this really thriving football culture, which had so many parallels to what I grew up with. And it, to be honest, isn't something that I would necessarily have associated with USA. So it's a really fascinating story from that point of view. And it's obviously rightly been very well received. Are there any future documentary projects that you're either thinking of or even working on at the moment?
Yeah, well, so we're working on a documentary, which right now we just finished that preliminary script, and it's called Voice of the Game, and it's about Manfred Schellscheit, very first A-licensed coach in the United States. So I had the privilege of playing for Manfred when I was 17, 18, 19 on a club team in New Jersey. And Manny had coached the full national team on down. I think his last job is into his 70s was as the under 14 boys national team coach. So he has an unbelievable coaching tree and influence, but you see my Arsenal top here. He's kind of like a Wenger-like guy, right? A kind of soccer philosopher. And his take on soccer and how he sees it is quite enlightening, right? So it's kind of, he just celebrated his 80th birthday. So we've interviewed him a couple times. And then we've interviewed the people around him, which include Bob Bradley, Jesse Marsh, Greg Berhalter, Richie Williams, Bruce Arena, Tab Ramos, and they're all now coaches, more or less, and they've been influenced by Manny and his philosophy. So when you do something creatively and somebody consumes it, they watch it, they read it, and then they give you feedback. My wife got a text message after a work colleague of hers, friend of hers, watched the film, and she goes, "I get it. It's a love letter." And I love that. Was amazing feedback, right? Because it was very much, you mentioned a passion project. Yeah, it's our love letter to American soccer. And I think this is another one in there. He was one of the first people I interviewed when we got the camera, and he's very wise guy. So we've kind of circled back. And we hope to have that done in the spring. There is a June 1 deadline we're working up against for the Kicking and Screening Film Festival, where Soccertown USA debuted and won the audience award. So yeah, we hope to push that one down the road. I clearly think there needs to be a documentary on the 1994 World Cup and its importance and its legacy from the American point of view. But yeah, I've enjoyed this way of telling stories. Back writing a book on the very earliest days of American soccer from 1884 to about the 1920s. So I enjoy having a foot in the 19th century and a foot in the 21st century. Yeah.
Yes. And I encourage everyone to watch Soccertown USA, soccer fans or otherwise. It's just a fascinating story. So with that, we would like to thank Mr. McCabe for his participation in this interview. As always, feel free to leave questions and comments. For any questions and comments, you may contact myself on my blog or on Facebook under Soccer Nostalgia. On Twitter, I'm at SP1873. Mr. Paul Biddle can be contacted on his blog, The 1888 Letter, and on Twitter, he's at 1888 Letter. You may also follow the podcast on Spotify under Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. Mr. McCabe can be contacted on Twitter at Tom McCabe 5. And the documentary has also a Twitter handle at Soccertown USA. And we've also shared the link on YouTube of this documentary. Again, all this information is on the blog and Spotify posting. So once again, Mr. McCabe, thank you. This was a very good and informative discussion. And as you said, you are a very good storyteller, and it shows in the passion in how you speak about this project. So thank you once again.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for spending all this time and doing what you do, because it's pushing the story on. I'm sure people will listen and watch, and future historians will get out a lot out of what you guys do. So thank you, and go Arsenal, right?
Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.